Model Rule 3.8, Section F, is about prosecutors making public statements or comments to the media. You may remember that a previous rule, Rule 3.6, is about litigators on either side of criminal or civil litigation making statements to the press. And that could be press conferences, news interviews, op-eds, and so forth. And the rule also applies, that rule applies to prosecutors. But given the stakes involved in criminal prosecutions, we have some additional restrictions on what prosecutors can say to the media. So let's dive in. Model Rule 3.8F says that a prosecutor shall, except in statements that are necessary to inform the public of the nature and extent of the prosecutor's action, and that serve a legitimate law enforcement purpose, refrain from making extrajudicial comments that have a substantial likelihood of heightening public condemnation of the accused. And, it continues, a prosecutor should exercise reasonable care to prevent investigators, law enforcement personnel, employees, or other persons assisting or associated with the prosecutor in a criminal case from making extrajudicial statements that the prosecutor would be prohibited from making under Rule 3.6 or this rule. Now, the main concern here is about influencing the judge or the jury in the proceedings, just like in Rule 3.6. But notice that Rule 3.6 refers to statements likely to influence the proceedings, whereas this is about public condemnation more generally. So yes, we are worried that the entire jury pool will be biased against the defendant from the outset, or that the judge will feel some kind of public pressure to ensure a conviction. But we're also worried about things like ongoing social stigma and retaliation against the defendant by vigilantes, even if the defendant is acquitted or the charges are dropped. Let's look at the comments for this section of Rule 3.8. Comment 5 says that Section F supplements Rule 3.6, which prohibits extrajudicial statements, that means outside of the courtroom, that have a substantial likelihood of prejudicing an adjudicatory proceeding. Now, of course, the fact that someone is charged or indicted at all carries some stigma, even if the prosecutor never talks to the media. And so it says in Comment 5, an indictment itself imposes stigma on the accused, but a prosecutor can and should avoid comments which have no legitimate law enforcement purpose and have a substantial likelihood of increasing public opprobrium of the accused. Now, I have to say that I have seen over the years prosecutor press conferences that I thought violated this rule. Whether or not the bar enforces the rule against a prosecutor is a separate question from knowing what the rule is for purposes of test questions, and that's what students should focus on. Also, notice that even though the prosecutor cannot encourage police to slander a defendant publicly or defame a defendant, and the rule even requires that prosecutors should exercise reasonable care to prevent this, we all know that prosecutors cannot control what the police chief says in his own press conference. And often this is the setting where the police chief publicly announces that they are certain of the defendant's guilt, that the defendant committed some heinous crime, that the defendant is dangerous, that the arresting officers are all heroes, and so forth. So in practice, a lot of times this is actually coming from the police officers doing press conferences, not from the prosecutor. That wraps up this part of the rule. There's still a little more to address in one more video.